Welcome to the night section.
He just pulled back and pushed forward and run him over. Two guys are laying down. 142nd, man.
What city are you in?
Compton, I think. I just passed by. They were fighting in the
still there?
Yes. We tried to follow the truck when we took pictures, but we don't know if we got a plate.
What's the location?
It's 142nd and Central, ma'am.
I don't know where you are. We're not in Compton, okay? So
Okay, well, I'm giving you the address. It's 142nd and the street is Central. Rosecrans and Central. Okay, if it's better for you.
What's your phone number? Chef? Yes. Okay, I'm going to disconnect. Ma'am, do you know the kind of...
Downey Rescue 445, be advised, we have a confirmation of one auto versus Ted, 142nd is Rosecrans.
45-10-4, and you're confirming that it is at 142nd and Rosecrans, 10-4, auto ped.
The infamous Suge Knight, one of the more scarier figures in hip-hop, former football star and bodyguard turned mogul. A 6'2" tank who is currently serving a 28-year sentence at R.J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego for voluntary manslaughter after running over two men at a Tam's Burger in Compton and ending the life of one of them in the process. At the time, Suge was said to have quote-unquote visited his former business partner Dr. Dre on the set of a promo commercial being shot for Straight Outta Compton back in 2015. It has been alleged that people were calling Suge and letting him know that the movie was very reminiscent of Death Row Records and that it was essentially becoming a Death Row movie, with even having someone play Suge Knight beating people up in studios and such. Therefore, Suge felt that he was owed money and he went to collect, which has been the common thread for most of Suge Knight's confrontations. So he paid the set a visit, but was basically kicked out by security, or rather asked to leave, because things quickly escalated into a shouting match. Now Clay Bone Sloan, who was acting as a technical advisor for the film, confronted Suge Knight to make sure that he left the premises. Shortly after Suge left, he made a pit stop outside of a Tam's Burger parking lot where he was confronted and had a physical altercation with Bone while still being inside his truck. In the security footage leaked by TMZ, which I will not be showing in this video due to the gruesome nature, you can see Bone approaching the car, and this is where the alleged punches were being thrown. The reason for Bone throwing the punches was because Suge Knight was allegedly bad-mouthing him. But then watching the video, you could see Suge Knight backing out with his truck, hitting Bone as quote-unquote self-defense. Now where Suge ran into trouble is instead of backing out and driving off, he ran into him again, where it appeared that he attempted to finish the job while also running over Terry Carter in the process. Now Bone survived despite sustaining serious injury, but Terry Carter, who was a music executive and an actual friend to Suge Knight, to whatever extent, didn't. Now what's interesting is that Terry was never meant to be there, or at least get hit. He was caught in the crossfire. Now there's different variations to the story and a lot of he said she said, where there's been stipulations and claims that Suge didn't actually hit Bone the first time and that he actually slipped, or the fact that he was on the phone with Terry after he left the set who was trying to mediate the situation, or people have suspected that perhaps it might have just been a setup, etc, etc. But we will go with the version of him just hitting the two men, because regardless of the minute details, as mentioned, Terry was Suge's friend, or at least someone who he respected, who did lose his life. And most of us know, and if you didn't know, now you do, this wasn't Suge Knight's first violent offense. This, however, was the nail in the coffin, a decline that finally reached the end, but this was preceded by many pitfalls in the years prior, particularly the fall of Death Row Records. Now before we get into the fall of Death Row Records, we need to gain more context and understanding of Suge Knight, the heart and soul of the label, as some might say, the beginning.
And I've always been the type of person where in class, I always been one of those, I want to make my own shit up. Like if the teacher say, well, write this, and we finna have a spelling test and we finna do mathematics, I be like, I ain't doing it. Then they say, well, draw something, tell us something, tell a story. I get to tell them, look, I'm gonna be a president here, I'm gonna do this. I always been the type of person that just have a dream of having a whole bunch of shit and bring all my friends along and make something happen. So I just want to be me. I never just set out to say I want to be this, but football was my goal. And when I got to that level where the football was, it was like fourth a lot of athletes and the coaches, it was a whole different twist than I thought it was. So it sort of disappointed me. So I decided to do something else.
But it sounded like you always did have the dream in mind to be the head of, and like you said, bring people along with you.
Yeah, I want to always. I felt that family and unity and love is the most important thing you have.
The beginning of Suge Knight. Suge Knight, born Marion Hugh Knight Jr., was born in Compton, California, April 19th, 1965, the youngest of 3 siblings. The alias Suge was derived from his childhood nickname, Sugar Bear. Raised in a lower middle class neighborhood in Compton with 2 working class parents. And I think it's surprising to some because the perception is that someone like Suge, or at least the narrative with a lot of black men that end up entangled in the justice system, is that they're usually coming from a broken home with a single parent. Majority of the time, the single parent being the mother. But this was not at all the case whatsoever for Suge. He was in a household with both his mother and father. However, it is true that the same couldn't be said with the friends and people he grew up with in Compton. Suge was the exception, not the rule. Now, Suge Knight's gangster reputation within the industry was an active choice on his part because, as far as we know, he did not grow up that way either. The prominent male figures in his life growing up, whether it be his father or uncle, weren't gangbangers. He did, however, grow up in a place like Compton where gang activity was prominent, and in his neighborhood in particular, it was run by the Bloods. But that wasn't supposed to be his fate. It was supposed to be football. Though Suge grew up with both his parents, he still didn't live in the best environment. I mean, he wasn't rich, so since he was a kid, he always knew that he wanted more, and the way to get there was through football. Now, Suge went to Linwood High School, 20 minutes away from Compton, where he was both a football player and a track star for the 4 years. Now, this was in the 80s where Suge was focused on his athletic career. So much so that after graduating high school, he earned himself a scholarship for football at El Camino Junior College, where he played for 2 years before transferring over to the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, otherwise known as UNLV, playing for the Rebels team after meeting Coach Hyde during recruitment, who then brought him to Vegas. According to an Anscape article written by Justin Tinsley, quote, as a junior, Suge started at nose guard and defensive tackle and immediately became one of the Rebels' best defensive players. Knight was voted UNLV's Rookie of the Year, named defensive captain, and won first-team all-conference honors. In a city full of sins, Knight was apparently UNLV's biggest blessing, end quote. And at the time, Coach Hyde claims that Suge was well-mannered and a type of player that any coach would want on their team. A yes sir, no sir type of guy. Now, Suge ended up playing 2 seasons at UNLV from 1985 to 1986. And at this time at UNLV, he was working as a part-time bouncer for a local nightclub called the Cotton Club, which will be relevant later in the story. It wasn't too long until Suge dropped out of school and was back in LA. And at that point, you think that clearly Suge Knight's football career was over, but it turns out during the late 80s, the NFL was actually going through a crisis. Now, players were on strike after the start of the 87 season because they demanded more money. And of course, owners didn't believe the players until they had to start scrambling for a roster for the season to go on. And I mean, desperate times call for desperate measures, which means they were calling up undrafted players, former college players, the neighbor, the cats, and the dogs, anyone and everyone to replace the players refusing to play in the season. And of course, guess who else got the phone call? That's right, Suge Knight himself. So what looked like to be a thing of the past, a football career that just tanked due to nothing else but Suge himself, Suge got another chance to really take this thing seriously in the big leagues. Well, at least that's what he thought. Amidst the protests, the replacement players were treated like crap by the contract players. Eggs being thrown, booed, the whole nine. And really, Suge ended up only playing 2 official games as an LA Ram and not really making a huge dent in terms of stats. And well, the strike lasted about 24 days until things went back to at least semi-normal. And at that point, in terms of football, it was over for Suge, done, finished, really a thing of the past. It was at this point that the gangster era of Suge started to take shape, as if some sort of shift within Suge started happening. I mean, he had instances of troublemaking before, like in high school shaking down white students, or reselling books in college as a cash grab. But nothing really stand out to signal that Suge would be a future felon, other than the fact that it's been rumored that Suge was a drug dealer back in his UNLV days. So other than that, from the outside looking in, as far as faculty, coaches, etc., he seemed to be alright. So by 1987, when he's officially done with football, it didn't take him too long to get into trouble. And the first time we actually really see him get into trouble with the law, this was in October of that same year. He got into multiple arguments with his then girlfriend, Sharitha Golden. Alleged threats were made, which ultimately led her to get a restraining order against him. She would then have him arrested on a domestic assault charge because they got into another argument while they're in Sharitha's mother's driveway, in which he grabbed her by the hair and took a pair of scissors and cut off her ponytail. Weird, I know, but Sharitha has recounted this incident and essentially says, and this is not verbatim, that because he liked her hair so much, he thought by cutting it off, other men wouldn't dare look at her anymore because he suspected her of entertaining other men at the time. He had the "if I can't have you, nobody can" attitude. However, what's even weirder is that she still ended up marrying him 2 years later, but I digress. But this wasn't the end of Suge's shenanigans. On Halloween night, which was just 2 weeks later after the chopping of the hair incident, Suge was again arrested, but this time it was because he ended up shooting his friend in Vegas, Ricky Crockett. Now they had a heated exchange and he just ended up popping him, once in the leg and once in the wrist, then attempted to make an escape, stealing his car, a Nissan Maxima, according to Randall Sullivan, the author of Labyrinth. But Suge only got a slap on the wrist for it. Instead of it being a felony charge, he was able to get it down to a misdemeanor. He was very lucky as he got away with only a $1,000 fine and a couple years probation, and this was mainly because of his reputation as a star athlete. It was also reported that allegedly the 49ers had made him an offer around this time in '87, but because of the situation, they wanted no parts. Now don't quote me on this because I'm not 100% sure if that's true, but let's go with it. Now that football was completely out of the picture, as I have mentioned a little earlier, Suge was working as a bouncer for the Cotton Club in Vegas. And after his football career, that's what he was doing for the next couple of years, working as a bouncer for various clubs and music venues in LA. By this time in 1988, he already had an interest in getting into the music industry, and this would be his first step. And in the process, he met Bobby Brown, which would change his trajectory forever. Now, Suge met Bobby Brown at an after party and basically shielded him away from crazy fans. And then faster than you could say supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, Suge became Bobby Brown's bodyguard. And let's just say with his size, intimidating demeanor, and stature, he was very good at it. And I'm pretty sure Bobby himself could attest to that. And progressively, he started getting more and more on the music business side. Now, Suge Knight himself credits a lot of his knowledge on the music business side being Bobby's bodyguard. After all, he would hear and see everything going on behind the scenes. As an example, he learned that writers, especially at that time, weren't getting their just due publishing money and were literally making pennies for their work. And that became a lane for him in the music business to make sure that artists were signing the right contracts and were getting paid their worth. Suge Knight, the manager, and the introduction to the d.o.c. and Dr. Dre. Now, through Suge's new venture of artist management, he would sign prominent West Coast artists like Mario Chocolate Johnson, the d.o.c., and DJ Quick. And through the d.o.c., Suge met Dr. Dre. At the time, the d.o.c. was a close affiliate and collaborator to NWA. For context, the d.o.c. was originally from Texas and had moved to LA to work with Dr. Dre and the rest of NWA. Dr. Dre had first heard of the d.o.c., who went by Doc T at the time, through the group Fila Fresh Crew, joined by two other members, Fresh K and Dr. Rock. They ended up landing a spot on the NWA and a Posse compilation album, and that was because Dr. Rock's connection to Dr. Dre. Dr. Rock was a DJ for the World Class Wrecking Crew for a short period of time, which Dr. Dre and DJ Yella from NWA were previously a part of. Soon after the Fila Fresh Crew's placement on a compilation project, they split up, and Doc T was now solo. Now fast forward, he moves to LA living with Dr. Dre, and he becomes an unofficial NWA member, changing his name to the d.o.c., which is an abbreviation for Dallas Oak Cliff, his hometown, to align himself with the group, with obviously NWA standing for N-words with attitude. And he wrote songs for Eazy-E and greatly contributed to projects for the group like Straight Outta Compton, and that's basically all to say that the d.o.c. had a very strong relationship with Dr. Dre at the time. Now, how Suge met the d.o.c. was through LA Dre. This was around the time that the d.o.c. was already signed to Ruthless Records, formed by Eazy-E and Jerry Heller. and released his debut album No One Could Do It Better, which was doing big numbers, becoming certified gold after only 3 months of its release in 1989.
When my record came out and it really started doing well, so quick, you know, and Funky Enough was #1 on the radio in California, up and down the whole coast.
The album was #1 for 2 weeks straight, right?
Yeah. So I was on one. I ain't gonna even lie to you.
Yeah.
Shit. I would walk into these clubs, and this when I had Suge with me. This when me and Suge first started hanging out. Yeah. And so
y'all met during that time?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. His brother, the guy he called his brother's name is L.A. Dre.
Okay.
Keyboard player.
Okay.
And so I knew L.A. Dre from Texas.
Yeah.
And so I met Suge through L.A. Dre and just started hanging out with him. At 19, 20 years old, he was taking me to clubs and shit. I wasn't supposed to.
He was older?
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Yeah. And he had a California, he understood the shit, he knew where to go.
Yeah.
And I was in there, you know what I mean? And when I get that all in me, ain't no telling what I do.
After the success of the d.o.c's album in 1989, 5 months later to be exact, he was involved in a near-fatal accident driving home drunk and high after partying and falling asleep at the wheel. And as a sidebar, this was around the time that he was basically going wild partying to the extremes every night. And Suge Knight was essentially acting as a bodyguard and bailing him out every time. But to get back on track, in the accident, he sustained serious life-threatening injuries. He wasn't wearing a seatbelt, causing him to be thrown out the back window, slamming face first into a tree. But thank goodness he survived. Unfortunately, what came with that accident was a crushed larynx, permanently damaging his vocal cords, which has changed his voice to become very raspy, scratchy, and harsh. I mean, he lost his voice, and we all know that's the worst thing that can happen to any rapper. Now, while he was hospitalized, Suge was very diligent on keeping up with him, with constant visits, asking him if he needed anything, bringing his mom to visit, etc., etc. Whether or not this was genuine or premeditated will obviously be revealed when we put the pieces of the story together further down the line. But what this solidified was the d.o.c's confidence in Suge. Now, what makes this relevant is because in this time of visiting him and showing concern for him, he convinced the d.o.c that he should become his manager. As we mentioned a little earlier on, artist management was one of Suge's newest ventures, and as his manager, he would later show quote-unquote concerns for the d.o.c's dealings with Ruthless Records.
Were you instrumental in making that happen, Dre and Suge?
Absolutely,
okay.
Bro. The shit wouldn't have happened had I not been there. And I'm just giving you some real shit.
No, good, yeah.
You know, because Dre didn't, you know, back then, Dre, he listened to me, he took my advice, you know, and so when I found out what Easy had been doing through the paperwork, you know, and how lacking things were, I told Dre and said, man, you know, it's no bueno, you know, like if he's doing it to me. And so Dre took it upon himself to check his own deals out and found out there were discrepancies. And so I says to him, you know, there's this guy, you know, his name is Suge, he can help us out. You know, we can plug us with this other guy, Dick Griffin, says it, you know, so we started taking meetings.
Dick Griff, you have to explain to people who he is, that name.
Dick Griffin is old school shit. He's probably Suge before Suge, but he had a record label.
Wow.
He had a record label called not Motown, Solar Records, like, and all the late 70s, early 80s stuff with the Deal and Shalimar and all of those Soul Train kind of acts came through Dick's company. So he was well versed. He had his own building with this huge studio in it. It was just dope. And so
he had a reputation about him.
Yeah, well, you know, they all do.
Yeah.
But I didn't know it. All I know is he had that big ass studio that was bigger than anyone we had ever worked in, with that big ass SSL, and it was an opportunity for me and Dre to start our own thing, to do our own thing. Now we know we gonna win, you know. So he and I and Suge and Dick sat down and formulated this company. At first it was called Future Shock. That was the name that Dre wanted to call it. And over time that morphed into Death Row. And by the time it morphed into Death Row, my name and involvement started to morph out of the paperwork. And, you know, Suge had turned from friend to bully, you know.
Now, the d.o.c. found out about his paperwork with Ruthless Records, went through it with Suge and a few lawyers, and they came to the conclusion that he was not being fairly compensated. He was essentially being paid pennies for all the ghostwriting he did for NWA. In an interview with The Source magazine in the early 90s, Suge stated, and this is not verbatim, that Jerry Heller signed the d.o.c. for a watch and chain in exchange for his publishing. Whether that is true or not, we won't ever know unless we saw the paperwork. But in any way that you put it, whether he meant it literally or metaphorically, it was not good. Suge's plan since then was to destroy Ruthless Records entirely, which meant destroying both Jerry Heller and Eazy-E. And that would mean to gradually get the Ruthless artists on his side, which meant starting a label of his own. And it has been said that he allegedly barged into Jerry Heller's office, intimidating the two bodyguards and ravaging through his files after Jerry Heller had refused the original request to see the contracts. And that's when Suge and the rest of the former Ruthless artists, including the d.o.c., then later Dre, found out that they were getting played. We don't know if this method of obtaining the contracts is 100% true, but it wouldn't be surprising. In 1989, with starting the label, Suge reached out to Tom Klein, a sports agent who he was working security for at the time, who was also eager to get into the music industry. So the three, the d.o.c., Suge, and Tom, would have plans on creating their first label called Funky Enough Records, named after the d.o.c.'s hit song, It's Funky Enough. Even recruiting artists like DJ Quick, who was an upcoming local talent at the time. Now, everything seemed to be set in motion until the d.o.c. felt that there was a missing element to the potential of this record label, which was Dr. Dre. As previously mentioned, the d.o.c. and Dr. Dre had a very strong relationship. I mean, they created music together, lived together, which meant they also confided in one another. And the d.o.c. basically told Dre about his contract situation and let him essentially know, like, hey, that if Eazy and Jerry are doing this to me, imagine what they're doing to you. Now, this led to Dr. Dre being curious about his own paperwork. Now, the people at Ruthless, Jerry Heller in particular, were not having that, which led to the d.o.c. introducing Dr. Dre to Suge as the guy that would help them out of this mess and getting him the paperwork. Now, once Dre saw his paperwork, he realized he wasn't getting his just due. Now, by that time, NWA was already over. I mean, Ice Cube had left and Eazy-E was set on lining his own pockets and didn't budge in terms of working out another deal. This meant that the d.o.c. and Dre would both distance themselves from Ruthless Records entirely, and Suge, to say the least, did what he did best in terms of the alleged intimidation to get both artists out of their contracts, along with other Ruthless artists like Michelle.
I get Dre.
What do you want me to do, interrupt the man?
Well, I want
Please.
to tell you the truth.
I'm a gracious host.
So anyway, what happened was I got Dre.
Right.
And starting a label, they want the name label Future Shock.
Right. The original name before Death Row.
Right.
Right.
So it was Future Shock.
Okay.
That was just a name they kicked around. And I wanted to go Death Row. There was a guy that had a Death Row, but he spelled it like Def Jam.
Right.
I'm like, you know, no offense, but you know, we from the ghetto, so if we're gonna say Death Row, it'd be the real Death Row, the man in the chair, and my homeboy just got out of prison, so he drew the logo for us.
Right.
Got to get the money back to the community, right?
The beginning, Death Row Records. Now we're gonna fast forward here a little bit to the start of Death Row Records. After the way Suge Knight was able to handle the business and get the job done, i.e. getting him out of his contract with Ruthless Records, Dr. Dre was now for sure convinced that this was the type of guy he needed on his side. In 1991, Dr. Dre, Suge, the d.o.c., and Dick Griffey from Solar Records banded together to start the label, which was originally meant to be called Future Shock Records as per Dre's request. However, both the d.o.c. and Suge Knight have claimed to have suggested the name Death Row, which was spelled D-E-F, a play on off of Def Jam recordings. However, the rights to the name were already taken by a previous associate to Dr. Dre, who went by the name of The Unknown DJ, to start his own record label at the time. But in July of 1991, they came to an agreement and he sold the naming rights to Dr. Dre and Associates. They eventually changed the name to Death Row Records, spelled D-E-A-T-H, by 1992. Now, how the exact name came to be has been up for debate, people claiming they started it like both Suge and the d.o.c, but there's another person who's actually pivotal in the creation of Death Row, and without him, Death Row would cease to exist. And that person is Harry O, or Michael Harris, who says he was the one who came up with the name due to his personal situation, and if you ask me, it adds up. If you guys didn't know, Harry O was a known drug kingpin in the 1980s. Per the Daily Mail, he was, quote, growing a vast distribution network reaching New York, Florida, Texas, Arizona, Louisiana, Michigan, Indiana, Iowa, and Illinois, supplied by Colombian drug cartels, according to the DEA, end quote. By the time Harry O was 26, he was bringing in at least $2 million a day, and that was up until the year of 1988, where he was convicted of attempted murder and drug trafficking, sentenced to life in prison. Fun fact, he spent over 30 years in prison and has only recently been released on January 19th of 2021. So from 1988 to 2021, he was in prison. But to get back on track, it would be Harry O to actually name and fund Death Row Records. Funding for Death Row Records, Michael Harris, Vanilla Ice, and Boss Man, Michael Harris. Suge Knight putting the label together would need funding for what would become Death Row Records. Turns out during that time, Harry O was already thinking of re-entering the entertainment industry. Fun fact, Harry O actually funded Denzel Washington's early plays on Broadway, and he was the first African American to actually produce a successful Broadway show called Checkmates, where Denzel Washington actually starred. Now, Harry O caught wind of Suge working with Dr. Dre and his plans to becoming a huge entity in the entertainment industry, in which, as mentioned prior, Harry O already contemplated re-entering. Thus, it only took a couple phone calls with Suge back and forth before they would meet. Now keep in mind, Harry O was serving time behind bars during this time, so he had David Kenner, who was Harry O's lawyer at the time, bring Suge to see him in prison. Harry O would ask Suge what it would take to make this label possible, and Suge suggested that they become 50-50 partners and asked for about $1.5 million. Harry O would then set up GF Entertainment as the parent company, making Death Row a subsidiary. According to Harry O, it was 100% ownership through his trust. Vanilla Ice. In the midst of getting Death Row together, Suge Knight had to clear up some other quote-unquote business. Mario Chocolate Johnson was among one of his first clients that he worked with, and success story in terms of a writer getting paid. Now, in the way that the job got done has been up for debate, but if you guys aren't aware, Mario Johnson was allegedly the one who wrote the lyrics for Ice Ice Baby, or at least co-wrote it, a massive hit record by Vanilla Ice, which came out in 1990. Now, of course, on Vanilla's end, according to Johnson, his attorneys tried to get Johnson to sign a ghostwriter contract, which basically meant that they would pay him $100,000 up front, but he would not get any royalties. And obviously, Suge advised to absolutely not do that, which was the right course of action, because now, over 30 years later, the record has sold millions upon millions worldwide. And that's well over 160 million at this point. So much so that it was reported that Vanilla Ice still earns about $400K a year off that record alone. And that's thanks to, you guessed it, royalties. Now, how Suge decided to rectify the situation with Vanilla Ice and Mario has come into question, and added to his mystique and gangster persona. But I'll let Ice tell it.
I had my bodyguards who had guns, and they had their people which had guns, and they had us outpowered and outnumbered.
Talking publicly about it for the first time, Van Winkle describes a terrifying night in his suite at a Beverly Hills hotel when he says Suge Knight showed up with 6 other men.
Roughed one of my bodyguards up. They roughed everybody else and my whole entourage up. Suge took me out on the balcony, started talking to me personally.
On the balcony?
On the balcony.
High above?
Like 15 floors. He had me look over the edge, show me how high I was up there.
Were you scared?
I needed to wear a diaper on that day. I was very scared.
On the balcony, Van Winkle says Suge Knight told him to sign over points from the song to a man named Mario Lavelle Johnson.
Who is Mario Lavelle Johnson? His name is listed.
That's the guy that Suge Knight brought over there that is an acquaintance of mine that had nothing to do with that song.
You signed over the rights?
Signed over the rights to him so that Suge and them could get paid for it.
So Mario Lavelle Johnson didn't write that song?
No way.
How much were those points worth?
About 4 million, 3 million, anywhere between there. $3 to $4 million. And you just signed them? I signed them. And walked away alive.
As heard in the clip, Ice claims that Mario had nothing to do with the song, and rather he was intimidated into signing points, aka some royalties away, and claims that Suge had him look over the edge of the balcony of his hotel room to see how high he was. And it doesn't take a genius to put two and two together to come to the conclusion that Suge potentially threatened to throw him over the balcony unless he signed the contracts. Now, the media ran with that story and claimed that Ice was hung over the balcony, but that wasn't true. However, according to Ice, he was in fact intimidated. Suge, on the other hand, has denied the claims of there being any form of intimidation. So I guess we will never really know the truth, but with Suge's track record, it's not something we can 100% rule out. According to the book Parental Discretion is Advised, The Rise of NWA and the Dawn of Gangster Rap, written by Jarek D. Kennedy, Suge Knight had originally sought counsel from Dick Griffey, an old friend of Suge's, founder of Solar Records, on the matter. A well-known legend who played an important role as a music executive in the 70s and 80s, signing funk, disco, and R&B artists and groups like The Whispers and Midnight Star. Now, Dick Griffey connected Suge at the time with a New York attorney, but then of course, Suge took matters in his own hands instead of going through the court system. Now, he first confronted Vanilla Ice at a restaurant he was eating at, and then turned up the ante when that didn't work. And that's, as we all know by now, showing up in his hotel room. Nonetheless, Vanilla Ice plays a very important role in this story because the points, or rather royalties, handed over to Suge were worth millions of dollars, about $4 million to be exact, and some could say that without Ice and that entire debacle, Death Row Records perhaps may have never come to fruition. It's a crazy thought to entertain, I know, that Vanilla Ice in an indirect way helped fund the legendary record label, Boss Man. It has been rumored that unofficially it was a hood dude that actually funded Death Row Records, as Keefe D in his book Compton Street Legend refers to the man as Boss Man. In the book, Keefe D mentions how Boss Man asked Keefe D to help move 300 kilos of quote-unquote unknown substance to help start up this record company called Death Row. Keefe D, with his crew, moved the product and delivered the money to where it needed to go, which we can assume was Suge Knight. Now, there's no way to confirm 100% that this is true, that this was the money that actually got everything started, or if it was perhaps just a contribution. But my best guess is that Suge used everything combined, from Harry O to Vanilla Ice to Boss Man. The rise and fall of Death Row Records.
Death Row is going on here tonight. The new explosion of the most powerful record label to come out into the market that I've ever seen in my life. And I mean that. Death Row, Death Row, Death Row. That's what's happening tonight.
1992. By 1992, Death Row Records was up and running. In that year alone, they signed multiple artists such as Daz Dillinger, Nate Dogg Corrupt, and Snoop Doggy Dogg. At the time, Snoop Dogg was Dr. Dre's protege. How Dr. Dre found out that Snoop Dogg can rap was at a bachelor party through Warren G, Dre's stepbrother, though he had known of Snoop Dogg prior as a street kid.
My baby bro, Warren G,
yes, sir.
He actually brought me the a cassette tape. And we were at a bachelor party, and I popped it in to listen to it like, whoa, I need to meet him. I need to meet him. And what it was the way he said his words and his voice.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I really like working with artists that have interesting voices. If you notice, most of the artists I've worked with, you'll know their voice as soon as you hear them.
Yes.
You know what I mean? So that was one of the things that really turned me on.
At the time, Death Row Records was in charge of creating the soundtrack for the 1992 movie Deep Cover, which featured the single Deep Cover with Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg. And soon they would work on Dre's debut album, and one of the greatest hip-hop albums of all time, by the way, The Chronic. The first single, Nothing But a G-Thing, dropped in November of 1992, peaking at number 2 on the Billboard Top 100 and number 1 on the Hot R&B/hip-hop singles and tracks. The single sold over 1 million copies in just a few months and was certified platinum. However, in this time and amidst the early success of Death Row, it wouldn't be too long until Suge once again did what Suge did best, and that was allegedly threaten people. Stanley Brothers incident. In the Death Row Records headquarters, it has been said that Suge Knight had a phone that no one was allowed to touch except him. It was the Harry O line, let's call it, and it was strictly for that use in the case that Harry O calls or he were to make the call to Harry O. Well, one day Suge Knight comes into the studio and finds one of the Stanley brothers, Linwood Stanley, on that phone. At the time, both George and Linwood Stanley, both rappers, were there to see Dr. Dre. Now, Suge told Linwood to get off the phone, and he resisted. Both brothers basically said, "F you, you're not Dre," saying in so many words like, "Hey man, you can't tell us what to do." Clearly, they had no idea who they were dealing with, but they were very soon about to find out. So Suge leaves, then comes back moments later with a gun and points it to their heads and tells them to get on their knees, ordering both of them to take off their clothes. They once again resist, so he fires the gun by one of their ears. He then proceeds to pistol whip Linwood Stanley, grabs their wallets, taking out their IDs, and lets them know that if the police finds out about what just happened, he will indeed find their families and will make do with them how he sees fit. You guys can obviously read between those lines, but of course they ran out the building, and what was the first thing that they did? Tell the police exactly what happened. This was the beginning of the end for Suge Knight in terms of his legal troubles, and as we saw the success of Death Row, we saw the many pitfalls over the years interwoven with the capital success when it came to the artists of Death Row and Suge Knight himself, leading to the eventual decline.